Despite not being featured too heavily, Project Cars 3 is a game that will always be important to the history of this channel. It was the first game that I ever reviewed, and in fact the first video where you unlucky sods heard my voice. A year later, I thought it was a good time to revisit the game, as in all honesty, I haven't played it too much following the few weeks after its initial release. I'm still as awkward as ever, but have my opinions changed on Project Cars 3? Now, if you haven't seen that initial review, the game was of course receiving a fair bit of backlash upon its release, but I was more inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt and treat it as what the game was, rather than what the games previously in the Project Cars franchise were. It was certainly very different, despite what Slightly Mad Studios would like to portray leading up to the game's release. We knew something was going to be different. But the bottom line is, at the eve of 2022, for now at least, Project Cars 3 still occupies a relatively unique space in the racing game market, and an interesting spot on the dichotomy between arcade and sim racer. It's certainly far more accessible, especially with a controller, than the likes of Assetto Corsa, or of course the previous two Project Cars games. It's now much more on the level of a Forza Motorsport or Gran Turismo in terms of driving physics, although it is different and certainly feels unique to those two games, because some of those sim characteristics still bleed over into the physics of Project Cars 3. There's a lot more lift-off oversteer, for example. Tracks certainly feel a lot bumpier and the cars less tied down than the two games I previously mentioned. It certainly rewards smooth driving and perhaps more of that hardcore sim racing ethos that you would use. It can take some getting used to, and you may find there are certain cars that you just don't like or cannot get on with. But that is where we run into an issue, because there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I've just mentioned the driving style that you do kind of need to have to master the physics of this game, but unfortunately that's at odds with the AI, which are also decent, but unfortunately in practice the two don't marry up all that well, because the AI seem tied down and stuck to the road at all times. They move around and they negotiate each other and you much better than most console racers do, I'll be honest. They're actually pretty good at defending, but in general they do give you quite a hard time, and with the collision physics being a bit wonky, it can lead to some frustrating spins and offs when you're playing through the career mode. Of course, as I mentioned, there are settings where you can alter the difficulty of your opponent and the AI aggression, but it's still not perfect, as that there are some balance issues that I've experienced quite frequently. With a career mode race, it's imperative to get to the front as quickly as possible, because if you don't, the first few cars, or maybe just the lead car, tends to disappear and you cannot catch them to save your life, but if you manage to get past them quickly, they seem to drop off the face of the earth and don't trouble you at all. This happens invariably between races. Some races it won't happen or won't be too noticeable, but there's definitely a pretty shoddy catch-up mechanic or something strange going on there. And if you do whack the difficulty and aggression up, the AI go through corners like 20% faster than is humanly possible for you, and it just feels artificial and kind of spoils the fun a little bit. So of course, to circumvent that, you have to dial the AI aggression down again. But there's still fun to be had in the career mode, where you work your way from Road E with your entry-level road cars, all the way through hypercars into the racing classes, that features everything from classic touring cars through to modern GTs and up to open wheelers. And it's also worth bearing in mind that races aren't the only thing that features in the career mode. There are some more arcadey style smash challenges called Breakout, which are a real challenge but certainly quite fun to do. There are also time trial challenges and the pace setter mode, where you have to set an average lap time over the course of say 3 laps of a circuit. And speaking of circuits, that's one big positive I haven't touched on yet, because the roster of tracks in this game is honestly second to none. And perhaps what's even more impressive is that each and every single one has dynamic weather where it can go from a sunny clear day to overcast to raining to even snowing, and you can use any class of car. So if you want to drive an LMP car on the Nürburgring in the snow, you can go for it. Touching back on the career mode and the progression, that is a very strange aspect of this game. Because, a la the Need for Speed Shift games that Project Cars 3 really is the spiritual successor to, there are mini challenges per race for you to complete. Well, I say mini challenges, but they're actually the be-all and end-all. Sometimes winning the race or even getting a podium isn't important if it's not on that checklist of things you need to achieve during the race, which of course is inherently weird because in real life, in games, it doesn't matter. The ultimate goal of competitive racing is to win, and if that's not always the goal, it does seem a bit of a strange target for that to be a part of Project Cars 3's career mode. It would be fine if they're just little side extras to add some spice to the race, but as I said, they're the be-all and end-all, and you can easily get distracted trying to complete those and lose the essence of why you're racing in the first place. It's very odd, I must say. But Project Cars 3 is nothing if it's not a unique game. Although, sometimes that uniqueness isn't really wanted. For example, the game's unique in having worse graphics than its predecessor, which really isn't acceptable. Luckily, many of the graphical bugs that plagued this game in its early days are gone, but still visually it's not really up to par, and it will still have that criticism levelled at it that it looks like a mobile game, which of course they did go on to release in the form of Project Cars Go earlier this year. Incidentally, I was part of the beta test for that game, but ultimately I wasn't very helpful in giving any feedback because I didn't play it much. The game was kind of a nothingness to me. It basically drives for you, and I know that's intentional, it's the style of the game, but it really wasn't for me. And truth be told, I haven't re-downloaded it since it's become available to the public. But as for Project Cars 3, the game we're talking about today, it's certainly much better. There's fun to be had, and of course you can pick it up cheaper now than you could from launch, so it's a good buy, but ultimately it falls short of being great. That's going to be it for my thoughts on the game. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.